You're listening to In the Fast Lane. This is episode number 10 of the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. My name is Matt Clayton, and this week we're going to take a deep dive into a MotoGP season that has been quite remarkable from day one with a very special guest, Australia's two-time MotoGP World Champion, Casey Stoner. In Formula One, we had the Italian Grand Prix at Monza last Sunday, and we had a first-time Grand Prix winner in Pierre Gasly, the Frenchman winning a restarted race for AlphaTauri after the initial race was red flagged following a big crash for Ferrari's Charles Leclerc. Gasly's the first French driver to win in Formula One since Olivier Panis in 1996, and it's the first time since Kimi Raikkonen won for Lotus in Melbourne 7 years ago that we had a race that was won by a team outside of Mercedes, Ferrari or Red Bull. It really was quite the stunning result at Monza. Joining Gasly on the podium was McLaren's Carlos Sainz in second and Racing Point's Lance Stroll in third. Before Sunday, that trio had combined for 3 career podiums. The other big story from this race was Lewis Hamilton, of course, who pitted from a commanding lead when the pit lane was closed during the safety car to remove Kevin Magnussen's stranded Haas from the side of the track. Hamilton was given a 10-second stop-and-go penalty and dropped to last, managed to fight his way back to 7th by the checkered flag, and actually retained his 47-point championship lead after Max Verstappen retired for Red Bull, and his Mercedes teammate Valtteri Bottas finished just 5th. Daniel Ricciardo had solid pace all weekend and came home behind Bottas in 6th, bagging another 8 points for Renault. And while we're on the subject of Australians, Oscar Piastri will head to the final round of the Formula 3 season at Mugello next weekend with an 8-point championship lead after a podium and a non-finish in the 2 races at Monza. But back to two wheels. 2020 has been a rough year for so many sporting codes, but we've had several seasons worth of drama and headlines from just 5 MotoGP races to date. We've had 3 first-time winners. We've had a rookie win in just their 3rd race. We're definitely going to get a new world champion, and we have an Aussie right in the thick of the title chase in our own Jack Miller. It's certainly been a compellingly crazy year so far. So crazy, in fact, that I'm almost willing to believe that my co-host could get on the podium if we offered him a wildcard ride. It's hello to Michael Laminato. Hi, Michael.
Hey, look, it'd just be another story in this season, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be that out of place, I think.
It'd only be about the 7th least believable headline that we've had so far. But, yeah, I mean, look, 5 races in, we've had half a dozen storylines that for any other season, a normal season in air quotes, would pass for probably the biggest story of the year. To your reckoning, what's the story that stands out for you most so far?
Well, look, I'm going to go for the easy one, really, and that is Marc Marquez's, I won't necessarily say his crash, but his absence. Because, and I don't mean that just in the sense that the world champion is missing. Sounds like the title to a great novel, doesn't it? But purely for the effect that that's had subsequently on the riders. You know, I thought it was really interesting. Miguel Oliveira, I think, was after winning his last race, said that riders believe now that they can win. It feels like it's such a mental mindset shift, not only for us viewing who have become so used to seeing one rider at the front, one bike inevitably finding its way forward and onto the top step of the podium, but for other riders to very suddenly and unexpectedly be instilled with the belief that a championship is up for grabs has really quite dramatically changed the complexion of this season in a way that I don't think simply Marc Marquez not being there describes sufficiently.
No, I'd agree. I think it was definitely the first domino, and all of the craziness probably links back to that. To my mind, I still think the Andrea Dovizioso dumping Ducati, where, you know, all of the other seats on the grid were pretty much taken up, and we figured that the delay there was a matter of making the money work for either side. The fact that he announced in the middle of a Grand Prix weekend, well, sorry guys, I'm actually not coming back next year, then goes and wins that race. He doesn't have an address for next season, and he could very well do the ultimate mic drop, win the championship without Marquez being on the grid, and then walk off into the sunset. So that is a fairly crazy story in itself. But, you know, in my long, short list of what we could talk about here, I think I probably had about 8 things, and you getting a podium on an Aprilia would probably just about scrape into the top 10. But look, so much has happened already that it's incredibly hard to know what comes next. I think that's why these remaining 9 races are going to be so eagerly anticipated by everyone who lives and breathes the sport. Certainly been no shortage of talking points, that's for sure, which makes it the perfect time for us to introduce this week's special guest. Joining us on this week's episode of In the Fast Lane, it's great to be able to welcome in a man who needs little introduction. He is a two-time MotoGP World Champion, the winner of 45 Grand Prix over an 11-year World Championship career, and of course he's a six-time winner of his home race at Phillip Island. It's a good morning to Casey Stoner. G'day Casey, how are you?
Good, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, going well, thank you. We were just talking before about this MotoGP season, only 5 races in. It sort of feels like we've had about 2 years worth of headlines in 5 races already. Are you enjoying it from your perspective on the couch, and how are you making sense of what's going on? Because quite frankly, the rest of us are struggling. There's been a bit going on. What's your perspective on 2020 so far?
I mean, I think it's fantastic that that racing is up and going again. It's great for everyone in the teams. Being able to at least justify their positions and sponsors, everything, keeping the whole thing rolling is as good as we can imagine right now. Unfortunately, I'm probably going to be a little, I suppose, opinionated with some things, but I think the first one is calling it a world championship is a little bit difficult this year. You're racing 2 races at the same circuit, and if the selection of circuits suits somebody, then it really is a big benefit to sort of do that, and not really traveling around the world. Creating a world championship is something I'm not a massive fan of, but the racing itself is fantastic to get up and going, and rather than these riders sitting around all year, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, look, the rest of us are certainly enjoying that. Just as an aside to that, I was going to ask you, do you still watch races when you're watching them on the TV through the lens of being a rider, or are you distanced enough now where you can just watch them as a fan? Because obviously, you're someone that loves bike racing, so that's where this all started, but do you still watch it from that perspective of being a guy on the bike and being in the fight with these guys?
When they're some really good races, and I see certain riders doing some pretty incredible things, and I see it as a fan. But unfortunately, you've always got that rider goggles on. You're always seeing it through the eyes of what you think they should be doing or what they shouldn't be doing, etc. I suppose feeling it through some of the results that have been happening to people. I think some results have been torn away from riders this year that just don't deserve it. I think things need to be a little more clear with track limits and things like that as well. When they're allowed to seemingly go off track and not be penalised, and when they're not allowed to go off track and be penalised. I think there's a lot up in the air at the moment that's making the racing very confusing for people and riders themselves. And they need just a few more clean lines and clear decisions on what they do in the end. I think that's where I do see it from a rider's perspective as well, and see the heartbreak sort of thing.
As you said, I mean, the pandemic has, of course, been the big story of this season. But once the season got started, the absence of Marc Marquez has become a close second, I think, in terms of effects on this campaign. You've mentioned the lack of the world aspect, I suppose, on the calendar, maybe affecting the title of being a world championship. But looking at the racing itself, which has been very close, does the absence of Marquez, the reigning and very dominant world champion, lessen the value of even that championship in the way that some people are sort of making it out to be?
Again, this is where I can start some controversy, but I completely agree. I think without Mark there, quite honestly, there's no leader at the moment. And you see that by the results, by the people that are standing on the top step of the podium. Mark was a clear leader and took that championship to another level. When I was there, it was myself, Valentino, Jorge and Danny that was sort of always at the front, stretching the field out, I suppose. At the moment, they don't really have that rider to do it. That is Mark, and show what you should be doing each week and a level of consistency throughout a season. Now, because this season's condensed, 2 races at each circuit, they sort of feel like, if they got a half decent result one week, they're going to be okay for the next week. It's a very, very different championship, and I think it's sort of upsetting the mix in a lot of ways like that. Then you've got 2 races that were red flagged and restarted, and I don't agree with not having the time that, say, for instance, Johan Mir was doing a great job in the first part of the second race there. It's in Austria, and then gets that just absolutely stripped away from him and ends up with no result. I just don't think that's fair. in racing in general, just to be able to go and put a full grid restart and let people go, well, I only have 6 laps to, sort of keep it towards the front. I don't necessarily agree with that sort of style of racing, I suppose.
We, for a moment, had the glimpse of Marquez maybe racing through a broken arm, which would have been incredible. A comeback only 4 days after injuring it, or 5 days. Racing through injury is almost a bit of a theme in MotoGP these days. I mean, you had a crack as well in 2012 in the last stages of your title fight then. And I mean, I think the average person probably finds the idea of competing while in a surgical condition kind of difficult to understand. Talk us through that idea of trying to breach the pain barrier and getting back on the bike. And what do you think Marquez would be feeling having to watch now 2 to 3 months, maybe the entire season from the sidelines, knowing he was probably a good chance here?
I mean, we've all ridden through injuries. I mean, if you don't, then you're certainly not going to be a MotoGP rider. Crashes happen. They're kind of unavoidable, and you sort of have to ride through it. But an accident as severe as Mark's was always going to be, in my opinion, quite impossible to do in that short time span that he tried to ride. So I think if he gave it a week or two, that first time round, he may have had enough strength and everything to then ride the rest of the season and come back and slowly get towards the front. And with the races the way they've gone, he probably still could have been winning. I think it was just far too premature coming back with an injury like that without at least having it pinned both sides of his arm. So it was always going to be a little bit too weak. There was going to be movement in there, things like that. So, I think it's got to be hard for him, because maybe waiting an extra week or two could have had him in there for the rest of the season and still had a very realistic shot at the championship. But now having to sit out for this long is got to be hard work for sure.
Well, particularly with the calendar being pretty short, as we know. I was going to ask you, Casey, actually, with Honda, are we now seeing that maybe Mark has kind of flattered that bike and the way that's gone over the past few years? Because I think one of the things watching this year is, one of the bizarre things, you kind of forget that the Repsol Hondas are in the race. They're right down the back of the grid, and they're not really, haven't been on the podium yet, haven't really featured in the races at all. Is this showing that perhaps he's ridden around some of the issues with that bike over the past couple of years, because no one's really been able to fire a shot on it? And as an aside to that, if you're Pol Espargaro right now, you're making the big move to the big glamour team for next year. Would you want that one back? Because you look at the relative performance of KTM. He's got to be a little bit concerned, isn't he?
I honestly think you could pretty much win with any bike on the grid there at the moment. They're all very similar. They just have some different traits to them and where they find their speed. The big difference is, again, there's no leader for people. And if you're not a leader, then you're a follower. And if you're a follower, then you've got to see somebody doing something on the bike to believe yourself that it can get there. It's not an easy thing. I went through it in Ducati that, when I wasn't there, the Ducati really sort of struggled a little bit. I'm not necessarily calling myself a leader, but I never looked next door and thought the grass was greener. I always this is the bike I've got to work with. So there's a way of finding speed out of it. And it's exactly what Mark does. He doesn't worry about the rest of it. He just worries about his own thing, find speed out of it, and then with that, people see what the bike can do, and they go, well, if he can do that, I can at least get closer towards the front. It's things like that happening a lot, and without Mark there, they certainly do seem to have lost their way a little bit in showing what the bike can do.
Moving away from Honda for a moment to one of your other former teams, Ducati, and of course Andrea Dovizioso's announcement that he's leaving at the end of the year has been one of the other major storylines of a pretty story-packed season so far. Caught a lot of people out that he was leaving all of a sudden, of course having no plan B, as he says. You felt in the past, particularly in your time as a test rider, that they don't always give enough weight to rider feedback. Do you still see that as a mentality at play at the moment, and what's your take on that whole situation?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty disappointed in Ducati. I think after all these years, they may have learnt to really look after the riders that have looked after them, I suppose. Andrea's been trying to get things done as I was, and a big reason why I left Ducati as a test role as well was it was just we could not get things through to them to make the changes for the rider. If they didn't see it in the data, they didn't really see it as relevant. So everything with a bike is about feel. With a rider, it's feel. It's not like a car where you can be strapped in and you've only got your certain elements there of just your steering trace, your brake and throttle. In a bike, you've got just a little bit of difference in your rider position is going to change the way the bike moves and the way the bike feels. So everything has to translate back through the rider. And when they've got somebody good at relaying that information like Andrea, then, they've got to listen to them. And it's a big part of what Andrea's, unhappy about is that it's been years and years now of, everything going through data, everything being about the engine and aerodynamics. And it's, pretty much one person's decision, I suppose, taking the Ducati. Now, it's very close to being a fantastic bike on the grid, but it's always missing that one fundamental, which is turning. And, it's something that, that comes from a rider and getting the feel with the chassis. And it's just always something that's been missing.
I reckon we could have asked you that question a few years back and you would have had a pretty similar answer as far as that goes, Casey. But when it comes to Ducati, of course, we can't not mention Jack Miller's move to the factory outfit next year. It looks like he may be in a bit of a leadership role there, judging by who may end up being his teammate. Do you think he's ready now, given his experience? He's still pretty young, but he's been around for a while now. Is he ready for that step up in responsibility and expectation? Because we know the speed's there. It's always been there with Jack, but starting to get some more consistent results. But do you think he's ready for that step up in responsibility and expectation to try and take them in the fight with these other manufacturers?
Only time will tell. But I've been very impressed with Jack over these last years, how he's come on, how he handles himself, how he goes about the race weekend. I think he's doing a very good job. I'd like to see him choose, harder tyres at times when he likes to choose the softer option. And sometimes it works for him, but other times not. So I always found running with the harder tyres, if you can set your bike up and your riding style around that, you're a little safer going into all these races. But other than that, I think he'll have no problem settling in there. It is going to be a very different situation. Being in a satellite team that's running basically the factory bikes anyway, it's quite a good gig that people that are in the situation don't realise. It's always a dream to get into the factory team, but there's a lot of pressure coming from there. You've got a lot more engineers, you've got a lot more expectation. You've got a lot of things that you've got to sort of deal with. But, Jack's been really progressing nicely over these last few years and, he should have no issues.
One manufacturer that's made a massive leap this season, probably right at the same time, judging by the state of things this year, is KTM. Brad Binder won in Brno, Miguel Oliveira last time out. Pol Espargaro almost. You think he's probably going to have a chance at some point this season. Just hasn't locked it in yet. From the outside looking in at this team, what's changed there to cause such a massive improvement? And, what impact do you think that your old teammate Danny Pedrosa, for example, has had as his role as test rider there?
It's having a leader, and whether it's a leader out on track to show what it can do, or a leader in direction. And that would be where Danny's job and where he's taken them, because, they've been there for a few years and sort of been stagnant over the last couple. And now that Danny's got in there and sort of directing them in the right direction. Danny and myself always sort of enjoyed similar bikes, always a little bit different, but certainly chassis-wise, we always generally chose the same chassis. If we had a selection of two, we basically went always towards the same one. And I'd say it's Danny that's really made the big key there on the fundamentals that bike needed, and they've made a massive step forward. In Brno, I'm not sure why the Yamahas chose those softer options or whatever they did, but it was a bit of tyre selection there as well, from what I understand, being all the way over here. But Brad did a great job. Pole probably would have been up there if he hadn't run wide and then come back together with Johan. In Austria, they've been consistently quick as well. But at the same time, Austria, like I said, when it got red flagged and they were, absolutely nowhere, no chance of winning the race. And then, the red flag happens and you get these surprise winners. So, it's been very, very impressive this year from the Austrian manufacturer for sure. And, I think to be honest, probably 70-80% of it has been Danny Pedrosa.
It's funny, Casey. I think it took us 15 minutes and someone finally said the word Yamaha, which is kind of bizarre when you think they actually won the first 2 races of the year and it's taken us this long to get to them. I want to get to Fabio Quartararo in a sec, but just wanted to get your thoughts on Valentino Rossi. We knew even before this season started that he'd be leaving the factory outfit at the end of the year. It looks pretty much odds on he'll be at Petronas for 21 at least. What do you suppose his motivation is at this point, at the age of 41 and with nothing really left to prove? And do you think he's earned the right to go out on his own terms, or is that a seat that would be better off in the hands of a fast young guy like a Quartararo or Franco Morbidelli have been for the past 2 years?
That's a very good question. I mean, Valentino's done a heck of a lot in the past, but in these recent years, he's been a top 10 guy. I still think he's got the speed to go towards the front, but in general, he's just missing that last little edge that young guys are willing to push and find speed that he just doesn't have, and especially doesn't have at the start of races. He generally sort of gets there towards the end, and his experience shows, but he's been lacking a little bit. So I think they've made the right decision, the factory team, with putting Quartararo in there, but we'll just have to see how Valentino goes in this Petronas team. I mean, they've been doing a good job. Where his motivation come from, I really don't know. He says he still loves it, but a guy like that loves winning. So it'd be hard for me personally to be running 5th, 6th spots consistently and treating podiums like wins when they're not actual victories in the way that he does. So it's very strange and hard to see him, to be honest, not fighting for those front positions a little bit more.
Quartararo's obviously been a bit of a standout with those 2 wins, but really the entire younger generation has been fairly impressive. There's Joan Mir and Brad Binder, Oliveira, obviously the last winner, even Pecco Bagnaia, even if we haven't seen much of him this season. Is there someone in particular from this next generation you find particularly impressive and could be one of, if not the major forces in the next couple of seasons?
To be honest, I don't know. Everyone sort of seems to be running that sort of similar position or pace. Pecco really impressed me in Jerez, and then he, absolutely crushingly had an engine issue. Of course, Fabio, we've known he was fast from last year. And he came out guns blazing this year, but at a circuit that he already had pole last year. So for me, that's not showing a lot. That's just showing that circuit really suits him. Then we see a circuit like Austria, and he was absolutely nowhere all weekend. So again, without that leader like Marc showing that you've got to be up there consistently, no matter the circuit, no matter the conditions, it's very hard to judge what these young guys can do. Once the field sort of gets stretched out a little bit and they've got somebody in there that's daunting to them, then it might change the results and where they come from. But we've got a bit of talent there for sure to have showings at the front. But I think consistent showings at the front, I haven't sort of seen anybody as yet. That's sort of proven they're going to be a consistent front runner. I thought Fabio was going to be a lot better this year, but Austria has been quite disappointing, to be honest. I know the Yamaha struggle, but it's still no excuse to be running that far back.
Yeah, look, I think time's going to tell with whether that Austria track and those 2 races there was a bit of an anomaly for them. Casey, one final one before we let you go. I'll give you a simple but a difficult question to finish. Who should win this year's title and who will win it? Now, they may not be the same rider or team, which is why I've emphasised both of those. What's your take on that?
Who should win it? In my opinion, is probably between Andrea and probably Maverick, to be honest, who should win that championship. They've had enough time there. They've got enough experience. They're the top, men in their teams. Realistically, they should be top 1 and 2 in the championship. But again, they've shown both in the past to be inconsistent with results. So it's making this championship very, very difficult to see who's actually got a chance of winning this. Anybody that hits a bit of form, at this point, without marking the championship, is probably going to win the championship. But as I've seen, anything can happen, and people that you thought were going to be runaways clearly aren't. So I think we're just going to have to sit back and enjoy this year and see what happens at the end. But I personally like a standout as much as people don't. They all love mixing it up and, having different people win races, etc. But I love seeing that rider that can get it together every weekend and sort of dominate people and put fear into the rest of the riders and watch everybody sort of scramble around trying to keep up. That's what I like to see. So, we'll see what happens for the rest of the season, but I think, it's going to be a mixed bag of results.
It's good to know, Casey, you've got about as much idea as what's going to happen for the rest of this season as the rest of us, so we're all kind of in the same boat. But look, mate, it's been terrific to catch up with you. Your insight's always so valuable when it comes to these things, and I'm sure you'll be eagerly awaiting what happens next when the season resumes at Misano. Really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Not a problem. Thank you very much.
That's all for this episode of In the Fast Lane. Thanks for joining us, and a big thanks to this week's guest, Casey Stoner. We'll be back next week to run through everything that happens on another big Sunday night on the couch, with MotoGP racing at Misano and F1 in action a couple of hours drive away at Mugello. And of course, we'll also be joined by another big name guest from the world of motorsport. Until then, for Michael Laminato, I'm Matt Clayton. Join us next time for another lap in the Fast Lane.